She did not remember a time before the rope. It was a presence against her skin, a coarse and constant truth that had ground her wrists to a geography of raw scabs and old, pale scars. It bit into her when she was pulled, and it hung loose and heavy when she was tied to a post, as she was now. The sun was a hammer in a brass sky. It beat down on the crown of her head, her bowed shoulders, her bare feet. The dust of the street was hot and fine, a reddish powder that coated her toes and clung to the frayed hem of her dress, a garment the color of dishwater and despair. She kept her eyes fixed on a single, splintered board in the saloon porch across the way. It was a focal point, a small, meaningless anchor in a world that had become a swirling vortex of noise and indifference. Voices rose and fell around her, a tide of murmurs, sharp laughter, the wet sound of a man spitting nearby. They were judging the thinness of her arms, the hollows in her cheeks, the wild tangle of her dirt-streaked hair. She had learned long ago to make herself small, to retract into a quiet, protected space deep inside. She was a stone at the bottom of a river, feeling the current rush over her without being moved by it. The auctioneer's voice was a sharp, grating thing, a saw cutting through the thick, hot air. He spoke of her as one might speak of livestock. Strong teeth. Good for work. Docile. The bidding was a pathetic affair, a slow volley of insults disguised as numbers. $1. $1.50. The men laughed. A woman in a dark bonnet shook her head, her lips a thin line of pious disapproval. The crowd began to thin, their interest waning like the afternoon light. She was not a spectacle worth their time. She was just another piece of human debris washed up on the shores of this hard-bitten town. Then, a silence fell. Not a complete silence, but a hollowing out of the noise. The auctioneer paused, his spiel catching in his throat. He stood at the edge of the sparse crowd, a man made of dust and distance. He was not tall, but he was solid, rooted to the earth like an old fence post that had weathered 100 storms. A worn duster, the color of the dry plains, hung from his shoulders, and his hat was pulled low, casting his face in a deep and unreadable shadow. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He did not look at the auctioneer. He did not look at the jeering remnants of the crowd. He looked at her. His gaze was not hungry or cruel or even pitying. It was quiet. It was an observation as steady and patient as the horizon. The auctioneer, regaining his footing, called out again, his voice slick with desperation. $2.25. A bargain for a strong back, gentlemen. The man in the duster lifted a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture. It was not a bid so much as a final statement. $3, he said. His voice was low and raspy, like it came from under floorboards. It was not a voice used to speaking in public. It was the sound of rust and dry earth. The auctioneer looked from the man to the sky, as if expecting a higher offer to fall from the clouds. None came. The few remaining townsfolk shrugged and began to drift away, the show now truly over. Sold, the auctioneer finally spat out, his tone sour. For $3 to Mr. Graves, he gestured with a grubby hand. She's yours. The man named Graves did not acknowledge him. He walked forward, his boots stirring small, lazy ghosts of dust. The ground seemed to harden under his tread. He stopped a few feet from her, and the world shrank to the space between them. The smell of sun-baked leather and something else, clean soil, maybe, drifted from him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn pocket knife. The blade clicked open. A small, sharp sound in the sudden quiet. He did not touch her. He reached for the rope where it was tied to the post, his movements economical and sure. With 2 quick, sawing motions, the fibers gave way. The rope fell from her wrists like a dead snake. She felt a dizzying lightness in her arms. A sense of being untethered that was almost more frightening than the bondage. She instinctively rubbed her chafed skin, her fingers tracing the raw, familiar grooves. He folded the knife and slipped it back into his coat. He did not offer a hand. He did not speak. He simply turned and started walking. After a few paces, he stopped and looked back, his expression hidden in shadow. It was not a command. It was an expectation. She hesitated for only a moment, a single, sharp intake of the hot, dusty air. Then she followed. The journey was a silent one. They left the meager cluster of buildings that called itself a town and moved out onto the open plain where the wind was the only constant companion. It was a mean wind carrying grit that stung her cheeks and tangled her hair across her face. Dust lifted behind them like a pale, pursuing spirit. He walked with a long, steady stride, but it was not hurried. It was the pace of a man who knew the land and his place in it. He never looked back to see if she was still there, yet she felt his awareness of her as surely as she felt the stones under her bare feet. He kept a careful distance, a space of about 10 feet between them, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm that separated their two realities. The sun began its long descent, painting the western sky in bruised purples and a slash of blood orange. The air grew cooler, raising goosebumps on her arms. Her thirst was a living thing in her throat, a dry fire. He stopped. Without a word, he unslung a dented metal canteen from his hip. He loosened the cap and held it out to her, his arm extended across the space between them. She froze, her eyes fixed on the offering. It was the first act of direct kindness she had received in a time so long she could not measure it. Kindness was a foreign language, and she had forgotten how to interpret its gestures. Her mind screamed at her to run, that it was a trick, a prelude to something worse. But her body, a more honest and desperate creature, betrayed her fear. Her gaze dropped to the sheen of water on the canteen's rim. Her throat worked. Slowly, like a fawn approaching a salt lick, she took a shuffling step forward, then another. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took the canteen. His fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second, his skin rough and calloused, a startling, solid warmth. She lifted it to her lips, tilting it carefully. The water was lukewarm and tasted of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever known. It was life. It was a promise. She drank, not greedily, but in small, measured swallows, trying to make it last. When she was done, she held it out to him. He took it, capped it, and slung it back over his shoulder. Then he turned and resumed walking as if nothing had happened. But something had. A single thread, thin as spider's silk, had been spun across the void between them. They arrived as dusk was settling into a deep, velvety dark. The homestead was a lonely silhouette against the fading light. It was a small, square cabin built of weathered wood the color of old bones, with a low-slung sod roof. A stone chimney stood crookedly at one end, and a single, unlit window stared out like a vacant eye. Beside the house, under a gnarled, leafless tree, stood a small, plain wooden cross marking a grave. The entire place seemed to be holding its breath, steeped in a silence that was older and heavier than the quiet of the plains. He pushed the door open. It complained with a low groan. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke, dust, and a deep, lingering emptiness. A simple plank table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the single room. A stone hearth, black with soot, dominated one wall. In the far corner was a narrow bed neatly made. In the opposite corner, a cot with a thin mattress and a folded, threadbare blanket. He moved to the hearth, striking a match. The flare of light threw his shadow, huge and dancing, against the wall. He lit a lantern on the table, and the room settled into a geography of soft, golden light and deep, pooling shadows. He gestured toward the cot. It was her space, her territory. He moved about the small room with a practiced economy, stoking the embers in the hearth, adding a few pieces of wood until a small fire crackled to life, spitting and hissing. He filled a pot with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the flames. He took down a slab of salted pork and 2 potatoes, and began to cut them with the same knife he had used on her ropes. The rhythmic chop of the blade against the wooden board was the only sound. She stood by the door, a phantom in the entryway, unsure of her place, of the rules. She clung to the doorframe as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. He did not tell her to sit. He did not tell her to help. He simply worked, his movements creating a small pocket of domestic order in the vast, echoing loneliness. When the stew was done, he ladled it into 2 wooden bowls. He placed one on the table for himself and set the other on the floor, near the edge of the cot. It was the way one would feed a timid animal, an act of caution and respect for her fear. He sat at the table and began to eat, his gaze directed at his own bowl. She watched him for a long time, the steam from the stew curling up to warm her face. The smell of it made her stomach ache with a hunger so profound it was a form of pain. Slowly she sank to the floor, pulling the bowl toward her. The wood was warm beneath her fingers. She ate with her hands, her movements furtive and quick, the hot, salty broth and soft chunks of potato a miracle in her mouth. When he finished, he took his bowl to a wash basin, cleaned it, and set it aside. He did not take hers. He banked the fire for the night, the light in the room dimming to a soft, orange glow. He went to his own bed, took off his boots, and laid down on top of the covers, his back to her. He did not lock the door. She heard the wind outside, a low, mournful howl. She saw the open doorway, a rectangle of deep, star-dusted night. She could run. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, she had a full belly and the door was not locked. She pulled the thin blanket over herself, curled into a tight ball, and listened to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing across the room. It was the sound of safety. The days settled into a rhythm as quiet and steady as the turning of the earth. There were no words, only work. He rose before the sun, and she would hear the scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the splash of water as he washed. He would leave a piece of hard bread and a cup of water for her on the table before heading out to mend fences that sagged like tired old men, or to work the stubborn soil of a small, fallow field. She began, tentatively, to inhabit the space he had given her. At first, her movements were confined to the cot, a small island of safety. Then she took the broom one morning and swept the packed earth floor, the whisper of the bristles a daring sound in the stillness. She washed their 2 bowls, the scrape of the cloth on the wood a small act of purpose. She learned the landscape of the cabin, the crack in the stone hearth that looked like a lightning bolt, the way the morning light fell through the single window to illuminate a constellation of dust motes. They worked in parallel, 2 solitary planets held in a silent, gravitational pull. When he was outside, she would watch him from the doorway, his back a strong, unbent line against the vast, empty sky. When she was inside, he would sometimes pause in his work and look toward the cabin, his face unreadable from a distance. One afternoon, a cold wind kicked up, turning mean and sharp. She was washing a rag in the basin when she saw him coming back from the far fence line. His shoulders hunched against the gusts. She took the worn, gray shawl that lay folded at the foot of his bed. It smelled faintly of him, of dust and faint sorrow, and when he entered the cabin, shivering, she held it out to him. He stopped, looking at the shawl, then at her. His eyes, for a moment, seemed to lose their haunted distance. He took it without a word and wrapped it around his neck. The gesture was small, but it felt momentous. It was a stitch binding their 2 solitudes together with a single, fragile thread. The next day, while gathering kindling near the edge of the property, she found a single, stubborn wildflower, a splash of defiant blue against the endless brown. On her way back to the cabin, she paused by the lonely grave under the gnarled tree. She knelt and, with hesitant fingers, pushed the stem of the flower into the hard-packed earth at the base of the wooden cross. It was a tiny offering to a sorrow she did not understand but could feel emanating from the very soil. Later, she saw him standing by the grave, looking down at the speck of blue. He stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. He did not look toward the cabin. He did not acknowledge her. But when he finally came inside for the evening meal, the set of his jaw seemed softer, the weight on his shoulders a fraction lighter. One night, the past came for her in her sleep. It came as a tangle of rough hands and jeering laughter, the suffocating darkness of a locked cellar. A scream tore from her throat, thin and sharp as splintered glass. She woke up thrashing, the threadbare blanket tangled around her legs like the ropes of her memory. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She was sitting bolt upright, gasping for air in the cold, dark room. Across the cabin there was a creak of bedsprings. He was standing now, a dark shape against the dying, orange glow of the embers in the hearth. He did not rush toward her. He did not speak. He just stood there, a silent sentinel, his presence a bulwark against the terrors of the night. Her breathing slowly calmed. The frantic bird in her chest settled its wings. The shadows in the room retreated, becoming just shadows again. "You hurt." His voice was a low rumble, barely disturbing the quiet. She shook her head, though he could hardly see it in the gloom. The words came out before she could stop them, a raw whisper torn from a place of deep, primal fear. "Don't lock me in." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, his voice steady and certain, "I don't lock doors." He returned to his bed and the silence resumed, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a silence filled with a shared understanding, a space where her fear had been met not with comfort but with a simple, solid promise. It was enough. It was more than enough. The next morning, as she was adding wood to the cook fire, the small object she always wore tucked inside her dress swung free. It was a small cross carved from a light-colored wood, worn smooth with time and worry. It hung on a frayed piece of twine around her neck. He was sitting at the table, sharpening his knife, and his hands stilled. His eyes fixed on the cross. It was a look of such stark, aching recognition that she instinctively snatched it and tucked it back into her dress, her heart beginning to pound. He did not ask about it. He looked down at his knife, at his own scarred hands, and a shudder came down over his face, the distance returning to his eyes. But she had seen it. She had seen the flicker of a wound deep and old that her small, wooden charm had somehow touched. Life stitched itself into a new pattern. She learned the weight of a full water bucket, the particular creak of the third floorboard, the way the wind sounded just before a storm. He seemed to be learning her, too, the way she flinched from sudden movements, the way she would sometimes hum a broken, tuneless melody when she thought he was not listening. One evening he came in from the fields carrying a sack. He emptied it onto the table and out rolled a handful of lumpy, misshapen potatoes and 2 withered carrots. It was the first harvest from the patch he had been tending. He looked at the meager offering, then at her. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Not much," he said. She reached out and picked up one of the potatoes. It was solid in her hand. "Real." "It's enough," she whispered, her first voluntary words that were not born of fear. They cooked them together, moving around each other in the small space with an unspoken rhythm. She scrubbed the vegetables while he added flour and water to a bowl, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked the dough for a flatbread. The smell of it cooking on the hot stone of the hearth filled the cabin, a warm, comforting scent that felt like home. He served the thin stew and the bread, which was slightly burned on one side. She took a bite. It was dry and hard. "That loaf died in vain," he said, his voice low and dry. She looked up, surprised by the flicker of humor. She took another bite, chewing thoughtfully. "A little dry," she conceded. He grunted. "You didn't complain about mine." The exchange was clumsy, almost meaningless, but it left a warmth in the air that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first crack in the wall of their shared silence, a small opening through which a new kind of light could pass. The harbinger of the past arrived on a Tuesday. It came not as a storm, but as a single rider, a small, dark speck growing steadily larger against the pale, bleached sky. Elias saw him first. He was splitting wood by the side of the cabin, the rhythmic thud of the axe a part of the day's heartbeat. He paused, axe held mid-swing, his body suddenly tense. She was on the porch, mending one of his shirts, and she saw the change in him. Her fingers stilled, the needle poised over the coarse fabric. She followed his gaze to the approaching figure. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. The world, which had begun to feel solid and safe, suddenly felt thin as glass. The rider was not the man she feared, but she recognized him. He was one of the men from the town, a lean, sallow-faced man who worked at the stables. He reined his horse in a dozen yards from the cabin, his eyes shifting nervously from Elias and his axe to the woman on the porch. "Graves," the man called out, his voice thin against the wind. "Got a message for you. From Mr. Barlow." The name landed like a stone in the quiet yard. Barlow. The man who had owned her, who had tired of her, who had cast her off at the auction for the price of a cheap bottle of whiskey. Elias did not move. He just stood there, the axe held loosely in one hand, his body a study in stillness. "I've got no business with Barlow." "He says you do," the rider insisted, unwilling to come closer. "He says the deal in town was just to clear a gambling slate. Temporary. He says the girl is his property and he's coming to collect what's owed." The man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "He'll be here in 2 days." Without waiting for a reply, the rider yanked on his reins, turned his horse, and spurred it into a gallop, eager to be away. The dust he kicked up hung in the air long after he was gone. The silence that fell was profound. The thud of the axe was gone. The whisper of the wind seemed to have died. The land itself was holding its breath. Elias slowly lowered the axe, leaning it against the chopping block. He turned and looked at her, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were dark with a storm she had never seen before. He was looking at her, but he was also looking through her, at the past, at the grave under the tree, at a world of loss he had tried to wall himself off from. She could not read his thoughts. Was he regretting it? Was he weighing the cost of $3 against the trouble that was now riding toward their door? The old fear whispered to her, telling her she was a burden, a stray that had brought wolves to the door of the one man who had shown her kindness. She should run. Disappear back into the wilderness that had birthed her. He walked past her into the cabin. She followed, her heart a cold, heavy thing in her chest. He went to the hearth and stared into the low-burning fire. For a long time he said nothing. The only sound was the crackle of the flames. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "He will not take you." It was not a question. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unmovable as the stone of the hearth. 2 days later they came. The sun was high and hot, beating down on the dry, cracked earth. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, their forms wavering in the heat rising from the plain. They did not move with the urgency of the messenger, but with the slow, arrogant swagger of men who believed the world belonged to them. Elias was waiting. He stood on the porch, his worn duster hanging on his frame. He was unarmed, but his hands were not empty. He held a small, carved bird in one hand, turning it over and over with his thumb. It was something she had seen him working on in the evenings, a small, simple shape emerging from a block of wood. She stood just inside the doorway, the heavy iron skillet from the hearth held tight in her hands. Its weight was a comfort, a solid, tangible piece of defiance. She would not be tied up again. She would not be dragged away. This small, quiet patch of earth had become her world, and she would not let it be taken from her without a fight. The lead rider was a large man with a florid face and a cruel set to his mouth. Barlow. His eyes swept over the small homestead with a contemptuous sneer. He reined in his horse, his 2 hired men fanning out on either side of him. Graves, Barlow's voice was greasy with false bonhomie. I've come for my property. Let's not have any trouble. Elias stopped turning the wooden bird. He looked at Barlow, his eyes level and calm. She's not property. And she's not yours. Barlow laughed, a short, ugly bark. I have the bill of sale from before. You paid a pittance to clear a debt, that was the understanding. Now the debt is paid, and I'm taking her back. The law is on my side. There's law, Elias said, his voice still quiet but carrying with a strange authority. And then there's what's right. You're not setting foot on this land. Is that so? Barlow swung down from his horse, his boots thudding on the hard ground. He hitched his gun belt. I think you'll find I can walk wherever I please. He took a step toward the porch. And then she moved. She stepped out from the shadows of the doorway and stood beside Elias. The iron skillet held at her side like a shield. Her hair was pulled back, her face was clean, and her eyes, which had for so long been fixed on the ground, were now lifted. They were fixed on Barlow, and they held no fear, only a cold, burning stillness. No, she said. The word was not loud, but it was clear and sharp and absolute. It was her own voice reclaimed. Barlow stopped, genuinely surprised to see her standing there, to hear her speak. His face darkened with fury. You insolent, get back inside. He started forward again, his hand reaching for her. Elias moved so fast he seemed to blur. He was not a young man, but there was a coiled strength in him. He stepped directly in front of her, blocking Barlow's path. He did not raise his hands to fight. He simply stood there, an unmovable object. I said no, Elias repeated, his voice dropping to a low growl. One of Barlow's men, seeing the standoff, dismounted and started forward, a length of rope in his hand. Let's just take her, boss. But as he moved, a new sound entered the charged silence. It was the sound of a horse whinnying, not from Barlow's party, but from the low ridge that overlooked the property. Everyone looked. 2 men on horseback sat there, watching. They were neighbors, the closest homesteaders, miles away. Men Elias had shared a nod with in town, but little else. They were just watching, their expressions neutral, their presence a silent testimony. Barlow saw them. His face tightened. This was no longer a private matter on an isolated patch of dirt. It was becoming a public spectacle, and he was a man who cared about his standing. He was a bully, and bullies relied on the isolation of their victims. He hesitated, his bluster draining away in the face of witnesses. He shot a look of pure venom at Elias and then at her. This isn't over, he spat. He turned, swung himself back onto his horse, and without another word, he and his men wheeled around and rode away, their retreat more telling than any fight could have been. They stood together on the porch, watching until the riders were nothing more than specks of dust against the horizon. The silence they left behind was vast and clean. The tension bled out of the air, leaving behind a strange sense of peace. The land, which had been a battleground, was theirs again. Elias's shoulders slumped slightly, the rigid control leaving him. He looked down at the small, unfinished bird in his hand, then he looked at her. The skillet felt impossibly heavy, and she lowered it to the porch floor with a soft thud. His eyes fell to her neck, to the spot where the worn wooden cross was tucked away. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, all the hardness gone, leaving only a raw vulnerability. Where did you get that? He asked. She pulled it out, the smooth wood familiar against her fingertips. She looked not at him, but at the cross, her memory going back years, to a dusty street in a different town, to a woman with kind eyes and a sad smile. A woman, she said, her voice thin but steady. She gave it to me. Long ago. She said it was for her daughter, the one she never got to hold. She said it would keep me safe. She looked up at him. Her name was Mary. The name hung in the air between them. Mary. The name on the grave marker. Elias's face seemed to crumble. The carefully constructed walls of his solitude, the fortress he had built around his grief, came tumbling down. He reached out, not to take the cross, but to gently touch it with one calloused finger, his touch reverent and full of a pain so deep it was holy. Mary, he whispered, the name a prayer. She was my wife. He looked at her then, truly saw her, not as the ghost of a past sorrow, not as a stray he had taken in, but as the woman who stood before him, who had stood with him. A piece of his lost life returned to him in a way he could never have imagined. "Do you have a name?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She shook her head. Names were for people who belonged somewhere. She had been called girl, wench, property. She had not had a name of her own for a very long time. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air of the plains filling his lungs, cleansing them. A decision settled in his eyes, a look of profound, quiet purpose. "Lena," he said. It sounded right. It sounded like her. "I think we'll call you Lena." The giving of the name was an anchor. It was a foundation stone. It was a rebirth in the long, evening shadows of the porch. Lena. She tried the name out in the quiet of her own mind. It fit. That night, a new contract was forged, not of labor and shelter, but of something deeper. After their silent meal, Elias took the ragged, filthy dress she had worn from the auction, the one she had kept folded in a corner like a relic of a former life. He walked to the hearth and, without ceremony, laid it on the burning logs. They watched together as the flames licked at the worn fabric. They watched it curl, blacken, and turn to glowing orange embers before collapsing into a whisper of gray ash. They were not just burning a dress. They were burning a past. They were burning the memory of the rope and the auction block and the name property. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And in the warm glow of the hearth, in the shared stillness of the cabin, something new was waiting. Weeks turned into a season. The harsh lines of the land softened under a blanket of early snow, and the cabin became a true sanctuary, a pocket of warmth against the vast, cold world. The house, which had once felt haunted by emptiness, now breathed. It was filled with the soft sounds of life. The scrape of a spoon in a bowl, the low hum of a tune Lena now sang without thinking, the steady crackle of the fire. One evening, they sat by the hearth, the wind howling outside, a wild and lonely sound. Elias was carving another bird, the shavings falling like pale snow onto the floor. Lena was stitching a patch onto the knee of his trousers, her movements deft and sure. He held up the finished bird. It was simple, elegant, its wings poised as if for flight. He held it out to her. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, polished wood. It was beautiful. "You were scared," he said, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the fire. It was a statement about the day Barlow came. "I know," she replied, her voice soft. It was not an admission of her own fear, but an acknowledgement of his. He finally looked at her, his eyes clear. "You didn't run." "Neither did you," she said. A small smile touched her lips, the first true smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. He looked at her, at the firelight dancing in her eyes, at the quiet strength that had taken root and blossomed in this harsh, unforgiving soil. He thought of the woman who had died, the life that had been stolen from him, and the long, empty years. And he looked at the woman who lived, who sat beside him now, stitching their two broken lives together with a needle and raw thread. He was no longer a man defined only by his grief. He was a man with a home. The final image was not one of passion, but of peace. They sat on the porch as the first thaw of spring arrived, the air smelling of wet earth and new beginnings. He was cleaning a tool, and she was shelling peas into a bowl, the soft plink of them a gentle percussion. The silence between them was no longer an absence of words, but a language all its own. It was a shared space, comfortable and deep, built from unspoken kindnesses, shared burdens, and the quiet certainty of standing together against the storm. The land was still harsh, the winters would still be long, but the house behind them was no longer hollow. It was full, and in its fullness they had both, finally, found their way home. This story, you see, it is not just about a rescue. It is not about a strong man saving a damsel in distress. It is quieter than that and truer. It is about the fact that sometimes the deepest wounds are not the visible ones. They are the hollow spaces inside, the ones left by loss and cruelty, the ones that make us believe we are unworthy of a name, of a safe place to sleep, of a simple, warm meal. Healing is not always a grand gesture. More often, it is a slow, patient thing. It is the offering of a canteen of water on a dusty road. It is the choice to not lock a door. It is the sharing of a meager harvest, a burned piece of bread that somehow tastes of hope. It is two broken people standing together and discovering that, side by side, their broken edges make a new and stronger whole. So here is your naming. In the quiet moments of your own life, look for the small gestures, the unspoken kindnesses, the shared silences that speak louder than any vow. These are the threads that stitch a life together. These are the things that burn an old life to ash so that a new one can rise. And if you are brave enough to offer that kindness, and braver still to accept it, you might just find that the harshest wilderness can become a home. You might just find that you were never property. You were just a person waiting for a name,